There has been confusion and many different teachings for centuries around the topic of the Christian's instruction on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The effect on people's lives who have been impacted by these teachings and even subsequent laws has caused catastrophic suffering for the same amount of history. For most people impacted by these corporate church doctrines, this has meant that many were forbidden from remarriage, which may have caused enormous heartbreak and loneliness and sorrow for so many over decades of their lives. Others were in abusive marriages who found themselves with spouses who were wicked, cruel, profane, callous, and grotesquely immoral. These poor people lived their lives in fear and under subjugation to tyrants, living with wicked people in daily persecution, violence, and torment that they couldn't escape from for the rest of their lives. As we begin this discussion, let's first remember that corporate paganized churches held enormous power over Europe for centuries, above the people and even above monarchs. Around the realms of family, marriage, divorce, and children, whatever ecclesiastical body that held the greatest power at any given point in history also made up many of the laws which ruled over the lands in these regards. The people of nations were entirely subject to the marriage doctrines of whatever corporate church held power within their nation at any given time. As the power of institutional churches declined in recent years, governments began setting up their own laws on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Their laws were originally based on many of the same doctrines that the institutional churches held. Then, over time, all moral foundations and biblical reasonings which were present in their marriage laws were tossed into the bin. So that today, all government marriage laws are entirely godless, heathenistic, and completely devoid of all foundation in morality, as well as being devoid of God himself, the author and binder of marriage. Historically, governments have gotten their ideas and laws on the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage either from corporate churches or as a means to secure their own agendas. One thing is for certain, these governmental laws have created great suffering for millions of people over centuries. For the Christian, they find that many church organisations of all varieties and commentators alike continue to sow great confusion on this topic, even up to this very day. Casting stumbling blocks before many, they lay burdens upon people too heavy to carry, whose lives continue to be impacted by suffering because of their erroneous teachings. I don't believe that the correct Christian understanding of marriage, divorce, and remarriage should be that difficult to discover in the pages of the Bible. I believe that the truth should be there for anyone who wants to look to discover the truth of God's laws for themselves. If the truth does lay in the pages of the Bible, and if we really do want God's truth, then the responsibility is on us to put in the effort required to find that truth. If we want to be led around as deaf, blind, and dumb by corporate churches who, as Pied Pipers, lead us astray, then we bring suffering upon our own heads by our own choices. We can only then blame ourselves for whatever errors we willingly follow after and any sufferings that may follow. In every aspect of our Christian faith, we should be studying for truth for ourselves, in our own Bibles, and with prayer for guidance from God, and with a concordance. Every true Christian should step away from the teachings and personal ideologies of worldly men and their institutions of religious power. In doing so, we might be able to free ourselves from the chains of bondage and suffering that so many false ecclesiastical groups, false religious leaders, and wicked worldly governments have laid upon our backs for centuries. For anyone who seeks truth, we cannot blindly trust any Bible version to give us accurate information. This is because so many Bible versions translate words surrounding the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage in ways that bring confusion. Some translations can be doubted whether they hold any accuracy at all, and doubted whether they have any interest in accuracy either. If we want truth, we will need to look a little deeper into the Hebrew and Koine Greek words to discover for ourselves that truth of God which we seek after. As always, if we genuinely do want the truth of God, we must each personally pray for it and strive for it, so that wicked men with wicked motives, or ignorant men and their ignorant followers, cannot rob us of the divine gift of God's truth, which is still available to all of us. Marriage is an act ordained by the laws of God, set up from the time that God put Adam into the Garden of Eden and later gave Eve to be his wife. Marriage, as created by God, is the union of a man and woman together as companions for the duration of their lifetimes. Marriage comprises of leaving parents behind to share a life together with a spouse and to create our own homes and families with them. Two people become one couple and live and walk through this world together as one. A marriage occurs and becomes lawful when the man and woman begin living together as husband and wife, and when they begin having intimate relations. No ceremony or any other act is required to create a God-ordained marriage. The union and living together as husband and wife is a God-ordained marriage. Obviously, most people who marry will have a ceremony, which also becomes a public acknowledgement of their marriage to all others. A betrothal period prior to the marriage begins when the man first asks the woman to marry him and when she accepts his proposal. During this time, the couple will spend time together and get to know each other and prepare for the time to come. A betrothal can be called off before a marriage occurs, and either party can then marry another person. There can be no sexual relations between the couple before or during the betrothal period. This ensures that both man and woman can go into their lawful marriage with each other as virgins. Or if the betrothal ends without marriage, then both people can still enter their marriages to other people as virgins. Under the laws of God, if a man and woman have consensual sex without being married, whether they are betrothed or not, then it would be expected that they will be immediately married. From the moment of betrothal, the marriage laws of God apply to each person as if they were already married. Sexual acts with another person during the betrothal is adultery. The marriage union lasts for as long as each person lives. What God has joined together, no man can tear apart. A marriage ends and the marriage bonds are broken when one person dies, or if there is a legitimate lawful divorce based on the laws of God. Jesus gave us a single cause for a lawful divorce when he used the Koine Greek word, porneia. Remember that word. It will have a lot of significance throughout this essay. Separating from a spouse and living as if divorced, and even if obtaining a government divorce decree without the lawful grounds for a God-ordained divorce, is not considered a lawful divorce by God. Therefore, any following marriage by either person is considered adultery. We are wanting to discover the original and everlasting laws of God on marriage. We are not wanting to follow the slightly different laws on marriage which were given to national Israel in their first covenant with God through Moses, although we must still use these laws to guide our understanding today. The original marriage laws of God still stand today and will stand for as long as the earth abides, with the sons and daughters of Adam still on it. Just as there are two stages to enter into a marriage, which are betrothal, followed by the marriage itself, so too are there two stages to end a marriage, to first separate from each other and then to finalize the divorce with a decree. The first step of divorce is most often phrased as being put away in many Bible versions. This is when either the husband or wife separate from the other. During the separation phase, the man and woman are still married, and the marriage laws of God still apply to both, until a lawful divorce has been enacted. Marrying or engaging in sex with someone who is separated is adultery, because that person is still married. There doesn't seem to be any information in the Bible about the process of divorce prior to the Old Covenant laws of Israel, and Jesus and the apostles never went into the full topic enough to give us an understanding of the process today. All we had then are the Old Covenant laws of Israel and just a few sparse teachings of Jesus and Paul to guide us in this area. The Old Covenant laws tell us that a divorce occurs when the husband gives the wife a written document of divorce. We learn from New Testament scriptures that a wife can also put away or separate from her husband and also divorce him. We can then assume that the same or a similar process would be in place for a divorce initiated by a woman. Mark 10:12 says that a woman who separates from her husband and marries another man commits adultery. And if a woman shall separate from her husband and be married to another, she commits adultery. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 to 11, tells us that women can separate from their husbands. Paul is here specifically addressing marriage laws for Christian couples. And to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. 1 Corinthians 7:15 tells us that both men and women can finalize a divorce. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. We don't know if there was a required time period between separating from a spouse and giving the final divorce decree to them. Maybe it was a year, maybe a month, maybe no time at all. We just don't know. That information is lost to us. Although we can reasonably consider that to stop any rash decisions that could completely ruin lives and families in no time at all, and in the heat of a moment, that a lengthy time period might be mandatory between separation and divorce. Let's reaffirm again that a divorce is only lawful under the laws of God for the reason that Jesus gave to us, when he used the single ancient Greek word, porneia. If an act of porneia has not occurred, then a divorce is not lawful, and both people remain married in the sight of God, perhaps for the rest of their lives. Whether or not they have separated or given a divorce decree to the other spouse is irrelevant. Once again, we don't have specific information in the pages of the Bible. One might consider, though, that if either separated party did commit an act of porneia during their separation, then perhaps a lawful divorce has occurred in the sight of God. One spouse then has the lawful grounds for a God-ordained divorce decree after an act of porneia has occurred, even if this happened many years after a separation. Providing that a lawful divorce has occurred, there are no special laws for remarriage. A lawfully divorced person can remarry as they wish, within the same marriage laws of God. We can reason this to be true because that is the very reason for divorce, to permanently, lawfully end what was a God-ordained marriage. Ending a marriage without a divorce is called separation, or being put away. If a person could not remarry after a divorce, there would be no reason for divorce at all. Jesus even cited an example of marrying a woman who was separated as being an act of adultery. From this we know again that remarriage after divorce was lawful, but not for those who are only separated, or for those who sought a divorce without lawful grounds. For the already converted Christian saint, they can only ever marry another Christian saint. They cannot marry an unconverted worldly person. While we are not under the Old Covenant laws, those laws are still our school teacher, from which we draw guidance, wisdom, and understanding of the mind of God for all areas of our lives. The New Testament is clear in its instructions from both Jesus and Paul regarding what is lawful divorce. Jesus tells us plainly that if we separate and divorce, and if that divorce is not for a lawful reason, then the divorce is invalid and the couple are still married. Paul later gives us an example of lawful divorce for a Christian. It is from Paul's instructions that we can then clarify what Jesus is saying, to give us a perfect understanding of what constitutes a lawful divorce in the sight of God. Let's first begin with Jesus giving us the only grounds for a lawful divorce. The King James Version says this: "It has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery." The sole grounds for lawful divorce is the word here translated as fornication. Other translations might use phrases such as sexual immorality, infidelity, unchastity, unfaithfulness, lewdness, or phrases with similar meanings, to erroneously portray a supposed act of adultery. Our most important word to understand divorce is the ancient Koine Greek word porneia, which was just here translated as fornication. Before we get to the word porneia, it must be pointed out that the King James Version has erroneously translated one other very important word here, which wrongfully changes the entire meaning of these verses in another way. It says that whosoever marries a woman that is divorced commits adultery. This is outright wrong, and is extremely and deliberately misleading. The word being used in this passage is the same word used earlier, which was twice translated correctly as put away, which means to be separated. But in the third instance, they instead translated it as divorced. Many other Bible translations also erroneously translate this word as divorced. Let's now read the same King James Version text with modernized English, with the insertion of the Greek clause word porneia instead of fornication, and to also properly translate the third instance for put away or separate. It has been said, whosoever shall separate from his wife, let him give her a writing of divorce. But I say to you, that whosoever shall separate from his wife, except for the cause of porneia, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is separated commits adultery. That certainly clarifies things, doesn't it? To marry a woman who is separated and who is not lawfully divorced from her husband is adultery, because she is still married, even if the husband gave the woman a writing of divorce, because the divorce was invalid and so the marriage still stands. The same law applies to men as it does to women. The text never says that to marry a divorced woman is adultery. This teaching is untrue. It is an untruth that has supported false church teachings which ban divorce and remarriage over centuries or even millennia. An untruth that was a stumbling block put before the children of God. An untruth that caused untold cruelty and suffering for centuries. The Koine Greek word porneia is used by Jesus as being the only grounds for lawful divorce. We now know that the ancient form of this word does not translate to adultery, like many or most Bible versions translate it to be. The Apostle Paul gives us one example of what constitutes lawful grounds for divorce. From this one example, we can then use our own reasoning to comprehend for ourselves what the Koine Greek word porneia might really mean. This reasoning should then teach us clearly what God's stipulations for divorce really are. And in the end, they may not be that difficult to understand. And to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband separate from his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife that believes not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not separate from her. And the woman which has a husband that believes not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or how do you know, O man, whether you shall save your wife? These verses teach us so much. The first two verses are instructions for Christian saints to stay in their marriages and not to separate. And if they do separate, they are to remain chaste, not to remarry and to try to return back to their spouses again. In this instance, there is no provision made for divorce. Lawful divorce is not possible because there are no lawful grounds for divorce. Obviously, because there has been no act of porneia by either Christian spouse, who are each trying to live godly lives. Next, if someone becomes a Christian and is already married to a non-believer, and if they are contented, then there is no need for them to separate. The non-Christian spouse may even become a converted Christian at a later date. Also, whatever protections that God gave to his saints in those troubled times would then extend over the rest of the Christian's family too. Remember, only Noah was counted as righteous, yet his singular salvation and safety also covered his sons and their wives too. While on this topic, it must be briefly noted from other verses in the same chapter that an already converted Christian is not to marry someone who is not a true Christian. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. That verse also tells us that a woman is bound to her husband for as long as he lives. As we know, this is true, except in the case of lawful divorce, which is another topic which is not being directly addressed in this single verse. Paul here is specifically addressing the true Christian saints who are married, amongst whom there would never be any lawful grounds for divorce, because none of them would engage in gross acts of immorality or wickedness that would constitute grounds for divorce. Finally, Paul tells us that if a non-Christian spouse leaves a Christian, then that Christian is not under bondage. Right in this very moment, we reach a crucial point in understanding lawful divorce. What does Paul mean when he says that a Christian is not under bondage if their unbelieving spouse leaves them? What is this word, bondage? Does it mean that the Christian is not obligated to stay living with their unbelieving spouse? And would this then force the Christian to stay forever married to the now departed unbelieving spouse, to be alone forever? Or does it mean that the Christian is free to divorce their unbelieving spouse if that spouse separates from them in order to end the marriage? If Paul means that the Christian is free to lawfully divorce their unbelieving spouse who has separated from them, we then have a precise example of what constitutes an act of porneia, the only grounds for lawful divorce which Jesus gave us. Whether or not we have an act of porneia, and whether or not we have an example of lawful divorce under commandment of God, hinges on Paul's use of the word translated as bondage. G 1402, doulou, is the Koine Greek word used. In most cases in the New Testament, it is translated as meaning bondage or servant. This information, along with the context of marriage in the verses we are referencing, obviously refers to a state of the marriage bond. Yet still, we don't have definitive proof whether Paul is condoning only separation or actual lawful divorce in the instance of the unbelieving spouse leaving the Christian. Later in the same chapter of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul makes two more statements about marriage, widowhood, and by implication, divorce. Are you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. In verse 27, like elsewhere, Paul is encouraging Christians not to marry during the time that they are living in, which involve the worst forms of Christian persecution and mass killings of saints. All Christians are literally waiting for the time of the end to arrive and for Jesus to return at any moment. Once again, in verse 39, Paul is referencing true Christian saints who have no grounds for divorce, because by the fact that they are true Christians, they don't sin in a way to warrant lawful divorce. The word used to describe being bound in these two verses is G1210, dio, which is different to the earlier word Paul used for bondage. Yet we can clearly see that both words mean the same thing. Both mean what they are translated as, to be bound or to be in bondage. In both of these verses, marriage is described as a person being bound or under bondage to their spouse. 1 Corinthians 7 verses 27 and 39 are our Rosetta Stone verses. We now have our perfectly clear explanation of what Paul was meaning earlier in 1 Corinthians 7:15, when he said that if an unbelieving non-Christian spouse leaves the Christian spouse, the Christian is no longer under bondage. To be bound or to be under bondage to a husband or a wife is to be married to them. Therefore, to not be under bondage to that spouse is not to be married to them any longer. Paul is clearly describing lawful God-ordained divorce in this situation. This means that when a non-Christian spouse leaves a Christian spouse, the non-Christian has committed an act of porneia. This then gives the Christian spouse lawful cause for a God-ordained divorce, which then allows the Christian to also lawfully remarry if they so wish. Paul has now given us a real-world example of what Jesus meant when he said that there are no grounds for a divorce except for the cause of porneia. In this example, porneia has occurred. So what is porneia? I believe that porneia would be any serious act of gross immorality, including ungodliness, including the serious breaking of the laws and commandments of God, and all types of wickedness. The unbelieving spouse in Paul's example is outside of godly covenant by being a non-believer. Most non-believers are living lives of ongoing unrepentant sin. Once this person then leaves their believing spouse, this then gives the believing spouse cause for lawful divorce. In the sight of God, the ongoing sinful life of the unbeliever, including their separation from their spouse, constitutes enough gross immorality in their unbelieving person that the saint has right to lawfully divorce. That was one of Paul's examples. The earlier example we also read was when Paul said that two Christians who were married could separate if they thought they had to, but they could not divorce, that it was good if they could reconcile. These two Christians couldn't divorce because they had no lawful grounds to do so. If each person were devoted true Christian saints, then neither of them could be accused of being engaged in serious gross immorality. Therefore, there are no grounds for divorce. This makes sense, and it's rather obvious. Now, let's reason further. It shouldn't be difficult for us to comprehend between right and wrong. What if a Christian woman's husband started a retail pornography empire with stores all over their nation? Is that Christian woman bound to this extraordinarily wicked man for the rest of her life, or is she free to divorce him and to perhaps marry a Christian man? What if a Christian man's wife started to put herself into pornographic magazines? Is that man still bound to his wife? What if a Christian man's wife deliberately ended a pregnancy? Is the Christian man obligated to stay with her forever and never to remarry? What if a Christian woman's husband started a business where he ended multiple pregnancies for multiple women every single day? Can the Christian woman never divorce her husband? What if one spouse murders another person? What if one spouse takes up armed robbery for a profession? What about stealing and chopping up cars? What if one spouse starts interfering with children? What if one spouse starts interfering with your children? What about sex tourism? What if one spouse joins the military or police or becomes a politician or a lawyer? What about drug dealing or manufacturing? What if the other spouse constantly curses God and curses the Lord Jesus Christ? These are just a few examples of what could constitute gross immorality, which is intolerable for the Christian saint. There are also so many types of gross immorality and wickedness that people can get involved in. People like this don't just commit occasional wrongful deeds. Their entire lives are given over to sin and wickedness. In all of these examples, is the Christian saint obligated to stay with their spouses forever in marriage when their spouses are engaged in any of the examples just given? The answer is clear and obvious. No, they are not. In such cases, the Christian saint would be obligated to remove themselves and their children as far away as possible from people like this, not only divorcing the offending spouse with the full blessing and permission of God, but if possible, never seeing them ever again. Simply because the Christian saint has no business to have any association with anyone who is living ungodly lives, and they should never be in any association with any person who commits gross immorality as defined by the laws of God. Porneia seems to be best translated as immorality, which in the Christian context would mean gross immorality or wickedness. And in today's wicked age, when adultery is legalized, celebrated, encouraged, and rewarded, acts of adultery too are also grounds for lawful, God-ordained divorce. Adultery is just another form of gross immorality, or porneia. Porneia can be 1,000 different things. The Christian saint has the full right and even obligation to separate and to lawfully divorce any spouse who is grossly immoral or wicked. There is no correctly translated scripture that says that a lawfully divorced man or woman cannot remarry. Lawful, God-ordained divorce is the same as if the other spouse dies. Therefore, that Christian saint is free to remarry only to another truly converted Christian, whenever they so please, after the divorce is finalized. People, false teachers, or paganized churches who teach cruel edicts that forbid almost all divorce, and worse yet, forbid all remarriage, set stumbling blocks before the children of God, compelling hardships, cruelty, and suffering, not only in the saints being forever bound to possibly wicked spouses, but also when good, innocent, God-loving people are forbidden from future happiness and companionship in remarriage and peace in life, turning the love of God by the saint into a chain of suffering in eternal cruel bondage while they are on this earth. We've covered everything to do with the eternal laws of marriage and divorce as authored by God, which we find in the Bible. Laws which God requires every son or daughter of Adam to live by for as long as this earth remains. We've also discussed particular marriage laws and lawful causes for divorce, which apply only to the Christian saints. Now, to gain even greater clarity on our subject matter, we must also touch upon the use of some other Hebrew and Koine Greek words which surround the topic of marriage and divorce in the Bible. These are important words, which are most often wrongly translated, either entirely in every instance in single Bible versions, or worse yet, when Bible versions aren't consistent in translating the same words when used in the exact same context across their own version, which once again brings even more confusion to those seeking truth of the will and commandments of God regarding his marriage laws. Let's clarify those words, so that when you do your own Bible study of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, you can look out for these specific words, which will prove to you too what the marriage laws of God are, and that they weren't that difficult to understand after all, and that maybe every Bible version in existence has not been doing such a great service to the sons and daughters of Adam in regard to revealing the truth about this topic. We want to find the specific Hebrew and Koine Greek words used for separation, divorce, adultery, bondage. Once we know what these words are and we look out for them, we can then instantly know when we read our Bibles with the help of a concordance exactly what the truth is. We will also instantly know if any Bible translations aren't being entirely accurate. The following words mean to put away, separate, send away, let go of something, forgive. H1644, Garash, H7971, Shalak, G630, Apollo, G863, Aphemi, G5563, Goritzo. When used in regards to marriage, they all mean to separate from the other spouse in marriage. They do not mean divorce or adultery or anything else. The following words are translated in Old and New Testaments as divorce. H3748, Kirithuth, G647, apostation, These are extremely specific words. They cannot be translated to mean anything other than divorce. The following Koine Greek words are translated as bound, bondage, servant. G1402, doulou, G1210, dio. When used in the context of marriage, it means the bond of marriage. It means the same as saying that someone is married. One person is bound to the other. Both Hebrew and Koine Greek are contextual-based languages. This means that when we translate words into English, which has a far larger vocabulary, our translated words can vary wildly based on the context of what is being discussed in the passage being translated. These translation techniques do not really apply in the marriage passages we will reference. We can translate our words directly, simply, and precisely. Having said that, this is the exact moment where great confusion enters into our biblical understanding of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. That confusion comes from the many Bible versions and how they choose to translate these words that I've singled out for examination. Whether intentional or not, when these words are translated erroneously, these very translated words then become the greatest single cause of all confusion surrounding the marriage and divorce laws of God. The biggest doctrine that so many Bible translations and institutional churches want to push in this regard is in the almost total prohibition of divorce and remarriage for Christians. And this is also the exact area where we will find the greatest number of mistranslations, with the result being numerous Bible translations which back up the favoured doctrines of so many worldly churches, which want to enforce a near total ban on divorce and remarriage for their own followers, for the populations that they have influence over, and for the true Christian saints. A doctrine which has been responsible for incredible suffering over centuries and millennia for the devoted saints of God, and for all of the ungodly others who were in times past forced to live under the false religious institutions of lost men. Let's look at some of those words and how they're translated. I'll use the King James Version as our example, though all Bible versions that I am aware of also have mistranslation issues in regards to marriage and divorce laws. I urge you to go onto a Bible comparison website to compare many other different Bible versions to see what they're doing with their translations. You can see for yourself where both truth and error are to be found. The words used for divorce in Hebrew and Koine Greek are correctly translated in every instance in the KJV. We have no need to review any translated scriptures for the word divorce. Our biggest target for inquiry revolves around the words which mean to separate from a spouse. We want to look out for any instances where these words are being wrongly translated as divorce and not to separate from or to put away a spouse. Here is our first example, first with the KJV, then with the modernized KJV with errors corrected. It has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. The corrected and updated rendering of the same text is, it has been said, whosoever shall separate from his wife, let him give her a writing of divorce. But I say to you, that whosoever shall separate from his wife, except for the cause of immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is separated commits adultery. The properly rendered passages are now crystal clear and concise. There is no confusion any longer at all. We see that the exact same word being used for separation 3 times in these 2 verses has been wrongly translated into divorce in the 3rd instance by the KJV translators. It is so obvious to see what they have done. They have created a false narrative and have given a false teaching on divorce, which then supports the doctrine that both international and state institutional churches were upholding at that time, and up until very recently, that of forbidding almost all divorce and remarriage. Yet in every other instance of the contextual use of this word in regards to marriage, The KJV translators have correctly translated the term put away, except in this one passage where they seem to want to create and support a false doctrine which forbids remarriage of anyone who is divorced. Even the KJV translator's choice to put the term of put away to describe the separation of two people in a marriage can be confusing for some people. Some may take this to mean another term for divorce, which it is not. It just means to separate. It is adultery to marry a woman who is separated from her husband. It is not adultery to marry a woman who is lawfully divorced from her husband. Now let's look at an example with the Hebrew word H1644, garash. It means to drive out, to put away, to separate, to push away. It does not mean divorce. There is a Hebrew word for divorce, and this is not it. Let's see what the KJV translators have done in Leviticus and Numbers, where they keep changing the word they translate this Hebrew word into. They shall not take a wife that is a whore, or profane, neither shall they take a woman put away from a husband, for he is holy unto his God. A widow, or a divorced woman, or profane, or an harlot, these shall he not take, but he shall take a virgin of his own people to wife. But if the priest's daughter be a widow, or divorced, and have no child, and is returned unto her father's house as in her youth, she shall eat of her father's meat, but there shall no stranger eat thereof. But every vow of a widow and of her that is divorced, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. The translators flip-flopped between translating the exact same word between separated or divorced based on their own biases, whereas in every single instance the same word means to be separated. Let's note here, every person who is divorced from their spouse is also separated. Not every person who is separated from their spouse is divorced. A divorced woman can be described as being separated, but a separated woman cannot be described as being divorced, unless she is that too. It would have been better for the translators to translate these passages consistently and truthfully. The point here is to see another example where Bible translators may and do translate words to fit in with and then erroneously support the doctrines that they believe or teach or follow. I will leave our examples here, otherwise I could add another hour to this video. Now that you know the words to look out for, why don't you now do your own research on your own favoured Bible version and see what other Bible versions have done in their translations too. A website such as Bible Hub or Blue Letter Bible have many different Bible versions to easily compare side by side. With concordance tools, they are a fast and easy way to discover the truth for yourself about what Bible versions have been doing for so many years. Then we can see where so much confusion has come from over so long in regards to the topic of God-ordained marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The Old Covenant laws of Israel were a school teacher to the nation, to teach the Israelite people how to live godly lives. We no longer live under the Old Covenant laws in the New Covenant age, and we aren't bound to those laws, but we learn from their wisdom and intentions and examples how God wants us to live our lives. We can learn from the old laws of Israel how God sees the seriousness of adultery, and how God wants us to ensure the safety of visitors to our properties. And we even learn about acts of compassion and brotherly love. The laws of the Old Covenant remain forever a wonderful school teacher for us. Yet the Israelite laws which teach us these things have not been in effect for 2,000 years, since the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and then the fall of Jerusalem, and with these things the death of the Old Covenant, which was nailed to the cross. All of God's eternal laws were also a part of the Old Covenant with Israel. For example, murder is unlawful for all eternity, and murder was also a crime in the Old Covenant laws. Some of God's eternal laws were altered and even laxed in the Old Covenant. This was so with the laws governing marriage. As Jesus tells us, the laws of Moses allowed a man to divorce his wife for any reason, to send her away back to her family. This was allowed because the people of Israel were a stiff-necked people, stubborn, set in their ways, and difficult to bend into the mould that God needed them to become. So in this instance at least, God allowed some flexibility. Jesus then tells his followers that the eternal marriage laws of God are different to those in the Old Covenant, that there is no divorce under any circumstances except for the cause of porneia, which we have ascertained to mean gross immorality or wickedness. For every son or daughter of Adam, including the Christian saint, we are bound to the eternal laws of God, and not the Old Covenant laws of Israel, which passed away thousands of years ago. For our discussion, let's look briefly at the old, defunct covenant marriage laws of Israel. From what we've already discussed, we know no fault divorce was allowed, and that a writing of divorce had to be given, that the betrothal period carried the same seriousness and force of law as marriage, but that a betrothal could be broken off by either person. There was no sex before marriage. A young unmarried woman is often referred to as a virgin in the Bible. That's because they are synonymous with each other. If two young people were caught engaging in consensual sex outside of marriage, the man would then pay a penalty of 50 shekels of silver to the woman's father for shaming her. They would be married. They could never divorce or even separate. For anyone engaging in premarital sex who wasn't caught, and if they didn't marry each other at a later time, if the woman was not honest about not being a virgin prior to her marriage, she would receive capital punishment when the truth was discovered on her wedding night. Falsely accusing a wife of not being a virgin after a wedding night, thus risking her to be subject to capital punishment and bring her into shame, would cause the husband to be punished by the elders. He would also have to pay his wife's father 100 shekels of silver. They could never divorce. Adultery, when married or betrothed, was a capital crime. If a man and a woman got divorced and the woman married another man, and if the second marriage ended in divorce or the death of the husband, the first husband could never take his ex-wife back again. We see weaved throughout all of these old laws the character of God, the holiness of God, the eternal laws of God, and what God requires of us. And these old laws teach us everything God wants us to know about marriage. God wants us to be virgins before marriage, to only ever share sex with one person, our wedded spouse, to stay married for life, to never divorce, to never treat our spouses with contempt, that even if we discover that we are not so pleased with our spouses after we marry them, we are to stay married to them. We also learn that there are some crimes so serious that they can forever lawfully end a marriage, that remarriage is lawful after a lawful divorce. Enormous paganized ecclesiastical institutions ruled over Europe for many centuries, organized and controlled both outside of and within nations. These false religious institutions made up their own rules about many different things, claiming to be acting on the laws of God, and thus they swayed laws and punishments within nations. These worldly church institutions would keep records of marriages, births, and deaths. Governments really wouldn't get involved in these matters. These churches claim to be interpreting and acting on the laws of God, while also claiming to be the representatives of Jesus Christ and God on earth. Whatever laws that these worldly and often ungodly wicked people would come up with in their own desires, intents, and interpretations would often become the laws of the land. This was true in the case of laws about marriage, divorce, and remarriage too. The dominant church institution of the land, acting as a quasi-religious government, would perform marriage ceremonies, which then constituted a lawful marriage within that nation, with the government having no part in any of these matters. These churches almost all ruled that all divorce was deemed unlawful, and that all remarriage was also deemed unlawful, except for a few loopholes that these people of incredible power deemed fitting. As we've discovered, the King James Bible translators even altered Bible verses just to uphold the doctrines of their state-owned church laws on divorce and remarriage, laws which had carried over from the doctrines and laws of an earlier paganised worldly church era. No doubt other government-commissioned and approved Bibles in other languages would have done the exact same thing, changing their own Bibles to match with their preferred religious doctrine and institution. It seems that all monolithic church institutions and governments in centuries past all wanted their people as miserable as possible, while laying as many stumbling blocks of suffering before the children of God as they could conceive of. For centuries, the dominant church of the land of the day ruled entirely over all aspects of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. As the mighty and monolithic worldly church organisations lost influence and power in recent times, they also lost many other government-sanctioned privileges too, which included the rights of performing, judging and record-keeping of births, deaths and marriages. Governments took over these roles, and they made up their own rules too. At first, governments closely copied the same laws as whatever dominant church had decreed in their lands in earlier times. Then, over time, as their societies became more morally corrupted, degenerate, liberal and wicked, governments then kept changing all laws regarding marriage, divorce and remarriage. For most Adamite nations, these marriage laws changed from the 1970s onwards. This is when no-fault divorce was introduced. Along with other revolting laws brought into place at the exact same time, and with the promotion of extreme promiscuity, these things together were the beginning of the modern-day destruction of the family unit within these same Adamite nations. As years passed by, family courts, erroneous domestic violence laws, corrupt child support systems, and many other grievous laws were all added into the fray. All of these things working together to bring us to where our nations are today. Our nations shredded into millions of pieces, with birth rates at almost zero, with nothing holding our nations together at all. The family unit and our nations have been almost completely destroyed at the same time. In discussing government marriages, we need to do so frankly and honestly. When two people want to get married today, they go to their government and ask permission. They are then granted a marriage license to allow them to get married. Think about that for a moment. Marriage is a lawful and godly union between two people. It is their business and their family's business and no one else's. By going to another person or party to beg their permission to get married, such people are explicitly and compliantly acknowledging that the other person or party owns them and has power to control their lives and decisions. Only a slave begs their owner's permission to get married or divorced or remarried. This is exactly what we do today whenever we beg our governments for their permission to marry or divorce. The moment we apply for permission to do anything, we are begging to whomever it is that we are applying to. Think about that for a while. It is here that I must state that I have no legal training. I am not offering legal advice. Whatever information follows is the opinion of a layperson only, and should not be considered as legal advice in any way. The laws that our governments run on today are civil laws. Civil laws are contract laws. Contract laws are trade laws. Trade laws come from shipping laws, which are often called maritime laws. Contract laws are commercial agreements between different parties. Contract laws are not real laws at all, but are defined by the term legal. Just because something is made legal, that does not make it lawful. Law comes from God. Legal comes from the trade agreements between men. When our parents registered our births with a government, that government then created corporations in our names. Whenever we engage with another party in any way, it is not us personally who is doing business with any other real person. Instead, we are representing a company which uses our name, and the other person represents a company which was created in their name. In this way, two companies are engaging in contract laws together, and they are governed by agreed-to trade laws. When a government or its agents ask for our name, date of birth, and an address, when we respond, we are identifying the company registered in our name for civil law purposes, and we, as living flesh and blood people, are also agreeing to represent that company in all civil law matters. This is called joinder. Our entire modern legal system works in this way. By doing this, governments completely ignore all the laws of God, to which all Adamite nations are bound to forever. They strip all Adamites of their God-given freedoms, protections, rights, and responsibilities under the laws of God. This is how governments make things legal which God deems unlawful. Today, every single so-called government-created law is a contract between whatever parties are involved. It doesn't matter what the law is, it is always a contract. Whenever one of these laws are broken, it is a breach of contract. A court is where a contract dispute gets settled by an arbitrator. Governments can make up whatever contract laws they like, so long as there is consent between the parties involved. The government can also mandate that consent of affected parties to their contracts is implied in their laws. Now let's look at these things in relationship to government marriage laws today. When we apply for a marriage license to the government, we are begging permission to enter into a legal contract between ourselves, the person we want to marry, and the government. Yes, we are marrying the government too. Government marriage is a three-way legal trade contract with no law involved. When we enter into a government marriage contract, we are implicitly agreeing to all other laws that the government passes regarding marriages, children, and divorce. We can call these the terms and conditions of the contract of trade. What our legal obligations are if we were to fall foul of our agreed-to responsibilities in regard to all associated marriage contract laws. If we want to divorce our spouse, we then go back to the government to beg permission to end the legal contract. To end the legal contract between ourselves, our spouse, and the government then forces us to go to their arbitrator, their court, and their judge to settle and finalise the legal contract. This will always involve the allocation of financial assets between the parties and what one party has to pay the other party for breach of contract. This is no different than when a business partnership fails. Who breaches the contract and who gets robbed and is forced to pay reparations for breach of contract has no correlation. It is usually the person who breaches the contract who is rewarded with financial takings from their innocent victim. Today, governments even pass laws that mandate that two people who live together are actually in the same implied marriage between themselves and the government. By doing so, they force all of these people too into the same marriage contract laws that people who have a government licensed marriage are bound by, because they willingly entered into those legal contracts. It's all a farce and a sham. Because the modern legal system is all civil law of contracts, governments can make anything at all a legal contract, and they can call it whatever they want and legalise it. Many contracts and breaches of contract used today under civil trade law use the same names that were used under real law given to us from God. This is one way we stay confused about how our legal system actually works. Lawful terms such as marriage, kidnapping, murder, theft, and so on are copied by civil law legal systems to keep us misled and confused. God-ordained lawful marriage is the union between a man and a woman joined together by God. Government marriage is a legal contract between any two or maybe more people and the government, joined together by the government. Government could even make it legal to marry a goldfish to a cactus, so long as they imply consent between the two parties in whatever contract law they make. Government marriage isn't marriage at all, and we need to stop telling ourselves that it is. Government marriage is a counterfeit, pretending to be God-ordained marriage, something that looks and sounds like real God-ordained marriage, but which on any examination proves that godly marriage and government marriage have nothing in common. One is a lifetime union between a man and a woman. The other is a corporate trade agreement between two or more companies and a government. Governments have no right or place inside marriage, divorce, or remarriage. The place of authority, the joiner, the lawmaker, and the arbitrator inside marriage is reserved for God alone. We as Christians should be at the leading front to stop recognising governments as having any part in marriages, and instead ignore their marriage contract laws and their so-called marriages entirely. We shouldn't be fighting against government marriage laws at all. We should be ignoring and dismissing their laws as a sham, not constituting a marriage, and to dismiss them as completely irrelevant. Government contract laws do not constitute real marriages. They're just legal contracts. Having said that, let us remember that according to the laws of God, whenever a man and woman begin living together as husband and wife, God has joined them together in marriage. So while the government contract laws they call marriage are a counterfeit and a sham, the two people who begin living together as husband and wife are still in fact married by lawful decree of God. And the marriage laws of God still apply to every son and daughter of Adam who marry. I've heard some strange notions and conclusions over the years by different people when it comes to the topic of marriage and divorce. I want to reason with a few of those ideas now, and also reason with general practical life applications once we have this new knowledge at hand regarding marriage, divorce, and remarriage. What does it mean if a Christian or Christians got married under government laws? It means that once you began living together as husband and wife, you became married by God. The marriage laws of God apply to you as they do to every other married Adamite couple. The actual government marriage means nothing in relation to God's marriage laws. However, you did enter into a legal contract between the husband and wife and the government, so the government legal marriage laws apply to you. How should a government married Christian enact a lawful, God-ordained divorce? The Christian must have grounds for divorce, based on porneia. This would mean gross immorality of the other spouse is required. A non-believer leaving their Christian spouse is one example of grounds for lawful divorce, but any form of gross immorality or wickedness by the other spouse are grounds for divorce. The Christian is required to first separate from their spouse for a reasonable period of time. The Bible doesn't give a time frame, but 1 year seems reasonable and is societally accepted. Then the other spouse is given a notice of divorce. Between the time of separation and the time of divorce notice, the two parties are still married. They cannot engage in relations with another person without committing adultery. In this case, because the Christian is under a government legal contract, he is required to terminate that legal contract in a government court. The divorce decree itself seems it would be enough notice of divorce to give to the other spouse to also create a lawful, God-ordained divorce. How should a God-married Christian lawfully divorce their spouse? In this scenario, it is implied that a man and woman began living together as husband and wife, that they didn't beg the government for a permission to marry, that they didn't engage in a government civil law marriage. There must be lawful grounds for divorce, based on gross immorality by the other spouse. The couple must separate from each other for a reasonable period of time to ensure no rash mistakes are being made. Then one spouse gives the other spouse a notice of divorce. During the time of separation and divorce, the spouses are still married and must remain chaste. Otherwise, they would be committing adultery. Such a notice of divorce could be a statement of declaration of divorce. Documents like this are usually witnessed by two other people. This notice is then given to the other spouse, at which time they become lawfully divorced by the laws of God. Just be aware that God-ordained marriages do not exempt either spouse from the clutches of government-made divorce laws. Remember that governments will imply your consent into their marriage laws at the moment you begin living together as husband and wife, regardless of whether you got one of their so-called marriage licenses or not. What if someone married and divorced as a non-Christian and later became a Christian? What does this mean for this person? Firstly, all Adamites are bound to the marriage laws of God, not just Christians, though it is the non-Christians who believe that they can do as they please and to completely ignore all of the laws of God. And it is the Christians who wish to understand and obey all of the laws of God. Was there a God-ordained lawful reason for the divorce to take place? Gross immorality by either party which caused the divorce. If so, then the divorce was lawful and the marriage has ended. If there was no gross immorality and both spouses have remained chaste since separation, then there was no lawful divorce and the couple are still married. The couple should try to remain chaste and try to reconcile. If the couple are both genuine Christians and not Sunday church Christians, then barring one spouse committing gross immorality, they have no grounds for lawful divorce. They remain married and cannot remarry without committing adultery. If an unbelieving spouse or false convert spouse wants to divorce the Christian spouse, then that is lawful grounds for divorce. The Christian is not under bondage to that marriage, and they can remarry only to another truly converted Christian. If a divorced woman has lived with another man, then the first husband cannot take her back again. This is Old Covenant law of Israel, which we are not under. But this is the mind of God on this matter and should be considered as extremely weighty in importance. We don't find a similar instruction in regards to a divorced husband in the same situation. What if someone remarries after an unlawful divorce? Then this is an adulterous marriage for all Adamites, not just Christians. In such cases, the ungodly will do as they please, as they always do, and this will be of no consequence to them. If the spouse who is a Christian was a Christian during this marriage and divorce, and the other spouse a non-Christian and initiated the divorce, then this was a lawful divorce, even without any other gross misconduct by the non-Christian spouse. The Christian spouse is free to remarry. If a person became Christian only after a divorce without a valid reason from another non-believer at the time of the divorce, then the divorce is unlawful by the laws of God and the couple is still married. In such a case, we must use our God-given reasoning to understand. If the non-Christian spouse then got married, lived together with another person, or committed gross immorality, then this is grounds for lawful divorce for the Christian. The Christian becomes lawfully divorced once the other spouse commits these gross immoralities, and the Christian spouse hands the other spouse a notice of divorce. If the couple had been living separately for over a year before this happened, then once again, this seems like a reasonable period of waiting between separation and divorce. If the spouse who later became Christian after unlawfully divorcing their spouse when not a Christian, then adulterously remarries another person while they were still living in ignorance, what does this mean for this now Christian person? We don't have a specific instruction in this case from the Bible. We aren't living under Old Testament laws anymore. So those laws for adultery are no longer taken into consideration. We therefore must reason with what we understand from the New Testament in order to find the truth. It is reasonable to conclude that if this divorced couple both moved on with their lives as divorced people, then enough gross misconduct has occurred by them both to make their once unlawful divorce now lawful in the eyes of God. If this now Christian person remarried in ignorance before their conversion, then yes, they sinned in entering into an adulterous marriage, but they did so in ignorance. They did so without the awakened moral conscience that God gave to them at conversion. When we read about the sins that Jesus forgave, we can readily come to a comforting understanding that God would also forgive this spouse in their sin of ignorance too. If time has passed by and both divorced spouses have moved on with their lives, then it is reasonable to assume that this couple have become lawfully divorced in this time from their own behaviours. Just the act of marrying another person is enough grounds to constitute gross immorality in the original marriage for lawful divorce to then take place. If these things be true, then the Christian saint is now in a God-ordained marriage, and their sins of ignorance were long forgotten and forgiven by God. The saint in these cases should be assured of their peace of lawfulness in their marriage and in their reconciliation with God. I cannot see any reason why an unlawfully divorced couple who remarried other people should ever get divorced from their second marriage for the sake of obedience to the laws of God. This would only be adding sin upon sin with two unlawful divorces. The first sin done in ignorance, the second sin done while in a state of salvation with God, while having a knowledge of the truth, making the second sin far more grievous than the first. Only forgiveness of God repays the debt of sin. That forgiveness is a gift. It cannot be attained through works, and we receive that forgiveness at our conversion. Likewise, I cannot see any way that an unlawfully divorced couple who have remarried should ever divorce their new spouses to remarry their old spouses as a means to please God. God gave us his thoughts on this scenario in the Old Testament law. His words were very strong and very clear that he saw this practice as an abomination. This is enough to know the mind of God, that we should heed the spirit of those words to this day. Let's review what God-ordained lawful marriages are and what God ordains as lawful grounds for divorce, which by implication then allows for lawful remarriage. Marriage as created by God is a lifetime union between a man and a woman, with God as the head, as lawmaker, joiner, and arbitrator. A lawful, godly marriage is created when a man and woman begin living together as husband and wife, as a family, and sharing intimacy. That's it. That's God-ordained marriage. No governments, no churches, no legal contracts, no government marriage licenses, and no other parties or processes are required. Usually a couple will have a wedding ceremony and a public announcement of their marriage, but neither of these are necessary to form a God-ordained marriage. If you are living together with a person of the opposite sex as husband and wife, then God declares you both as being joined together in marriage for life, as husband and wife. There is no such thing as living together or living in sin, as they used to call it. Having said that, in today's world, it has become normalised that living together is no big deal, and moving in together is something a couple does on some random weekend. It is in both of their minds that there is no real commitment between the couple, that living together is something casual, that is not as serious as marriage, that the union can be broken off at any time, and for any reason. This is all twisted thinking and twisted logic of the modern age. For these reasons, it does seem obvious that most people still require a marriage ceremony, ritual, and public acknowledgement of their marriage, even a signing of marriage documents with witnesses, before they would take their own lifetime unions seriously. Although God requires none of these things. Jesus teaches us about the eternal marriage laws of God, that divorce is only lawful on the basis of what is defined by the ancient Koine Greek word, porneia. Most Bible translations will erroneously render this word to mean some type of adultery. There is a word for adultery in ancient Greek, and porneia is not it. Also, when Jesus taught these things, the Old Covenant was still in effect, and he was talking to an Israelite audience who were under the Old Covenant, and adultery was still a capital crime. You can't divorce someone who is dead. Paul gives us an example of lawful divorce. In his example, it is when a non-believer leaves a Christian, that the Christian is then freed from the bond of marriage to that person. This act therefore constitutes an act of porneia. Porneia can be reasoned to mean any ongoing behaviour of gross immorality or wickedness. A spouse who is engaged in unrepentant gross immorality or wickedness can then be lawfully divorced, not only as an option, but as God requiring his servants to have no association with the ungodly, the corrupt, and the wicked of this world. Divorce is the end of a marriage bond and union. A person who is lawfully divorced can remarry as they wish. A converted Christian saint can only marry another converted Christian saint. Otherwise, the non-believer would become a negative influence towards sin and ungodliness upon the Christian saint. Whatever any government or church declares about marriage, divorce, or remarriage, or what they say is or is not marriage, is completely irrelevant. It is time that governments and false worldly man-made churches are put in their place and publicly expelled from the sphere of marriage altogether. God alone is author, joiner, and arbitrator of all marriages. God joins together in marriage, not man, not church, not government. A Christian should feel completely free to ignore and disregard all government civil law contracts, which they erroneously name in counterfeit as marriages. We can ignore their civil law marriage licenses and their civil law divorce courts too. Obviously, though, should a Christian ignore and disregard all government marriage laws, this does not mean that the saint would be free from government interference and enforcement of their civil divorce laws upon them. Legal rules which rule over us by implied consent into their civil law contracts. If the Christian divorces their spouse, even if they never engaged in a government civil law marriage, they still must deal with corrupt and wicked pagan government courts, judges, lawyers, and civil laws. There is no way to ignore and avoid these corrupt systems at this present time. God's marriage laws apply to all sons and daughters of Adam, just like all other of the laws of God also apply to them. However, it is the true Christian saint who seeks to reveal and honour and live by those laws of his Maker. The ungodly and the wicked care nothing about any of the laws of God. I hope this information has brought truth and understanding to every true Christian saint who strives to uncover the truths and laws of God and to abide in them. And I hope this may have shattered many stumbling blocks which false religion have deliberately set before the sons and daughters of God over centuries.